I'm Esther, 62, sitting at my son David's wedding, watching him twirl his bride across the dance floor. My heart swells, but there's a weight I can't shake. My late husband Harold left me $7 million, a secret I've kept from everyone here. Beverly, my new daughter-in-law, glances my way. Her smile too sharp. I clutch a faded photo of Harold in my purse, his words about trust echoing. Something tells me to stay quiet. Am I right to hide it? Where are you watching from? If this resonates, please like or subscribe for more stories of silent strength. The phone rang as I stood in Harold's study, my fingers tracing the spines of his old history books, their leather covers worn from years of his late-night reading. I'm Esther, 62, and this room with its faint scent of pipe tobacco still feels like him. The wedding was 3 days ago, and David's call caught me off guard. His voice, usually warm, sounded tight, like he was reading from a script. "Mum, just checking in. How are you holding up financially?" he asked. Too casual, too quick. I froze my hand on a biography of Lincoln Harold's favorite. The question wasn't like him. Before I could answer, Beverly's voice chimed in smooth as silk. "We're just worried, Esther. You're all alone now. Did Harold leave you comfortable?" Her concern felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the words in a mirror. I pictured her at their new house, her manicured nails tapping the counter, waiting for my response. "Oh, he left just enough," I said, keeping my tone light, though my stomach twisted. Harold's words from his hospital bed echoed, "Guard what we built, Esther." His hand, frail but firm, had held mine as he said it, his eyes pleading. I'd nodded, not fully grasping the weight of his estate then. $7 million tucked away in accounts and investments, a secret I hadn't shared, not even with David. I changed the subject, asking about their honeymoon plans, but Beverly pressed on. "You know, estates can be complicated. We could help you sort things out, make sure you're secure." Her voice was syrupy, but there was an edge, like she was fishing for something specific. David stayed quiet, and that silence stung worse than her probing. My boy, who used to run to me with scraped knees, now let his wife steer the conversation. I mumbled something about being fine and hung up my hands, trembling. I sank into Harold's old chair, the leather creaking under me. The room felt too big, too empty. I'd always thought David would be the one to fill it, to keep our family's heart beating. But now, with Beverly's voice lingering in my ears, I wasn't so sure. The doorbell chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Rose, my neighbor, 70 years old and spry, carrying a tin of her famous oatmeal cookies. "Saw you looked pale at the wedding," she said, setting the tin on the coffee table. Her eyes, sharp behind her glasses, studied me. "Everything okay with that new daughter-in-law of yours?" I forced a smile, offering her tea, but her question hit too close. "Over cups of chamomile?" Rose told me about her own son's wife, years ago, who'd sweet-talked her into signing over a chunk of savings only to vanish when the money ran dry. "Some people see family as a bank," she said, her voice low, like she was confessing a sin. "You watch yourself, Esther." Her words settled like a stone in my chest. I wanted to tell her about the call about Beverly's probing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, thanking her for the cookies. After she left, I wandered back to Harold's study, my eyes landing on a locked drawer in his desk. I'd avoided it since his passing, too raw to face his papers. But something urged me to open it now. The key was hidden in an old cigar box, just where he'd always kept it. Inside the drawer was a ledger, its pages yellowed but neat, filled with Harold's precise handwriting. Rows of numbers, accounts, investments I'd never known about. My breath caught as I scanned the totals, each one larger than the last. $7 million more than I'd ever imagined. I closed the ledger, my heart pounding, and slid it back into the drawer, locking it tight. I stood there, staring at the desk, the weight of Harold's trust pressing down on me. Beverly's voice replayed in my mind, her questions sharper now like needles. David's silence was louder still. I wanted to call him back, to demand why he let her ask those things, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was protecting and why my heart told me to keep it hidden. The house felt colder after Rose left, the silence thicker than usual. I stood in Harold's study, the locked drawer now a secret between me and the past. My sister Catherine's name lit up my phone, her call coming just as I was about to spiral. At 65, she's always been the blunt one, her voice cutting through my fog. "Esther, you sound off," she said, not wasting time. "What's that new wife of David's up to? I saw her at the wedding." All smiles, but her eyes were calculating. I paced the room, my slippers scuffing the hardwood. Catherine's words were a mirror to my unease, but saying them out loud felt like betraying David. She asked about money. I admitted, my voice low as if the walls could hear. David didn't stop her. Catherine snorted, her disapproval sharp. "Watch that girl, Esther. Some people latch onto grief like vultures. You don't owe them a dime." Her warning hung heavy as we hung up. I wanted to believe David was just caught up in love, that Beverly's questions were innocent, but doubt gnawed at me, a quiet ache that wouldn't let go. I sank onto the couch, my eyes drifting to the wedding photo on the mantel, David's arm around Beverly, her smile too perfect. I'd framed it yesterday, hoping it would ease the sting of that call. It didn't. I got up, needing to move, and found myself in the kitchen brewing another pot of tea. The kettle's whistle was a small comfort, a sound Harold used to love. I could almost see him at the table, stirring sugar into his cup, teasing me about my weak blends. That memory cracked something open, and I realized how alone I felt without him to anchor me. David was supposed to be that anchor now, but he felt so far away. The phone rang again, and I hesitated, fearing it was David with more questions. It was my sister's voice, but this time she was softer, sensing my silence. "Esther, you don't have to tell him everything. Harold trusted you to decide what's right. Don't let guilt make you weak." Her words were a lifeline, but they also sharpened the truth. David's loyalty was split, and I was on the losing side. I hung up and walked to the living room, where a small box of Harold's keepsakes sat on a shelf. I hadn't touched it in months, too raw to face the memories. But tonight, I needed him. Inside was a watch, its face scratched from years on his wrist. I held it, the ticking faint but steady, like his heartbeat once was. I remembered the day he bought it, a rare splurge after a promotion, his grin wide as he showed it off. For our future, he'd said. That future was now, and it was mine to protect. But protecting it meant questioning my own son, something I'd never imagined. I thought of calling David, asking him straight why he let her ask those things, but my courage faltered. What if he chose her side? The thought was a knife twisting deeper than I expected. I set the watch down, my hands unsteady, and looked at the wedding photo again. Beverly's smile seemed sharper now, like a warning I'd missed. I moved to the window, staring at the street where David used to ride his bike, shouting for me to watch his tricks. That boy was gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized. The ledger in the drawer felt heavier, its numbers a burden I hadn't asked for. I couldn't shake Catherine's words or Rose's story, both echoing the same truth. Trust could be a trap. As the night deepened, I stood there, the ache in my chest growing, knowing I had to face whatever came next. The dining room in David and Beverly's new house gleamed under a chandelier that looked too grand for their budget. I sat across from them, the table set with china I knew David couldn't afford. At 62, I'd learned to notice excess, the kind Harold always warned against. The air felt thick, not just from the roast's aroma, but from something unspoken. Beverly smiled, her lips tight, and said, "Esther, we're so glad you could come." Her voice was warm, but her eyes darted, calculating. David barely looked up, cutting his meat with focus. I wanted to reach for him to find the boy who'd cling to me during thunderstorms, but he was a stranger tonight. Beverly filled the silence, her words polished. "This house is a stretch for us, you know. The mortgage is brutal. Maybe you could help out a little." She tilted her head, her tone so casual it almost hid the weight. My fork paused mid-air. Help out. The phrase landed like a stone, stirring the unease I'd carried since their call. I glanced at David, waiting for him to speak, to say this wasn't his idea. He didn't. His eyes stayed on his plate, and that silence cut deeper than Beverly's request. My throat tightened, a familiar ache from nights spent wondering if I'd failed as a mother. I forced a smile, saying I'll think about it, though my mind screamed. Marlene, David's old friend from high school, sat beside me. Her lawyer's instincts sharp. She leaned close, her voice low. "Beverly's got a reputation, Esther, always chasing the next big thing." Her words were a whisper, but they landed like a warning shot. I nodded my fingers, twisting the napkin in my lap. I remembered David at 10, promising to always take care of Mum after Harold fixed his bike. Where was that boy now? Beverly kept talking, her voice bright, about renovations and dreams for the house. Each word felt like a hook, pulling at the inheritance I hadn't revealed. I sipped my wine, barely tasting it, my mind on the ledger locked away at home. $7 million. Harold's life's work meant for our family, not for her ambitions. I glanced at David again, hoping for a sign he wasn't part of this. Nothing. Then I saw it glinting on Beverly's neck. My silver locket, the one Harold gave me on our 10th anniversary. I'd kept it in a jewelry box, never lent it out. "That's lovely," I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. "Where'd you get it?" Beverly touched it, her smile faltering. "Oh, this I found it at your place when I helped clean after the wedding. Thought it suited me. Found it." The lie was so bold it stole my breath. I'd never asked her to clean, never invited her to rummage through my things. My hands clenched under the table, the napkin now a crumpled mess. David looked up finally, but his eyes slid past me to Beverly, soft with trust. I wanted to scream to demand why he let her take what was mine, but I swallowed it, the bitterness lodging in my throat. Marlene caught my gaze, her expression grim, like she'd seen this play out before. The room felt smaller, the chandelier's light too harsh. Beverly's voice droned on about curtains and loans, but all I heard was the echo of Harold's warning, "Guard what we built." I stared at the locket, its delicate chain a betrayal around her neck. My heart pounded not just with anger but with a deeper hurt, the kind that comes when you realize your child might not choose you. Driving home, the streetlights blurred through my windshield, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. The dinner lingered like a bad taste. Beverly's locket glinting in my mind. David's silence louder than ever. At 62, I thought I'd seen enough to trust my instincts. But this hurt was new, raw, like a wound that wouldn't clot. I pulled into my driveway, the house dark, its stillness a mirror to the emptiness growing inside me. I couldn't shake the image of David's averted eyes, his loyalty slipping away. Inside, I dropped my purse on the counter, the clink of my keys echoing. The phone buzzed and I braced myself, half expecting Beverly's voice again. It was Eleanor, my friend from church. Her voice soft, but urgent. "Esther, I heard you were at David's tonight." "You okay?" she asked. I sank into a kitchen chair, the wood creaking under me, and told her about the dinner, the locket, the mortgage talk. My voice cracked, betraying the calm I'd tried to hold. Eleanor listened, then sighed, her words heavy with her own regrets. "I gave my son too much, Esther. Thought it'd keep us close. Now he barely calls unless he needs something." Her story hit like a punch, stirring my fear that David was drifting the same way. I pictured him as a teenager bringing me dandelions from the yard, his grin wide and unguarded. That boy wouldn't let Beverly wear my locket, wouldn't sit silent while she asked for money. But this man did. I hung up my chest tight and wandered to the living room where a stack of old mail sat unopened. I sifted through it, desperate for a distraction, and found a card from David's high school graduation. His handwriting scrawled inside. "Thanks for everything, Mum." I traced the words, my eyes stinging. Had I missed something some moment when he stopped being mine? The question gnawed each thought a step deeper into the hurt. The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep was impossible. I stood at the window staring at the moonlit lawn, remembering how David used to chase fireflies here, his laughter filling the summer nights. Now those memories felt like relics, overshadowed by Beverly's ambition and his complicity. I wondered if he even saw me anymore, or if I was just a means to an end, a vault for their dreams. The thought was a blade slicing through the love I'd always trusted. Eleanor's words echoed too much, too late. I thought of calling David, demanding answers. But what would I say? accuse his wife and risk pushing him further away. My fingers hovered over the phone, then fell. I couldn't face his voice. Not now. Not when it might carry her influence. Instead, I sat on the couch, the card still in my hand, its edges worn from years of keeping. The weight of Harold's absence pressed harder. His steady presence the only thing that ever made sense of my fears. I looked toward the study where the ledger sat locked away, a silent reminder of what was at stake. Beverly's locket. Her words, David's silence, they wove a net around me, tightening with every breath. I felt trapped not just by their expectations, but by my own failure to see this coming. The hurt wasn't just betrayal. It was the dawning truth that my son, my only family, might not be mine anymore. As the night stretched on, that realization settled like a stone, heavy and unyielding, pulling me toward a breaking point I couldn't yet name. The doorbell rang on a grey Tuesday morning, sharp and insistent, pulling me from a restless nap in Harold's study. I'd been avoiding the world since the dinner, my heart bruised from David's silence and Beverly's boldness. At 62, I thought I'd faced every kind of hurt, but this was different. I opened the door to find Beverly standing there, her smile polished, a man in a suit beside her. "Esther, this is Lloyd, our notary," she said, her voice bright like she was offering a gift. Lloyd shifted his briefcase clutched tight, his eyes avoiding mine. Beverly stepped inside without asking, her heels clicking on my hardwood floor. "We've been thinking about David's future," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "This is a family agreement, just to make things clear." She slid it across the kitchen table, her fingers lingering on the paper, her eyes locked on me, expectant. I sat my hands cold and opened the folder. The words blurred at first, legal terms, swimming in fine print. Then I saw it, a transfer of assets. A chunk of Harold's estate, my estate, redirected to David and Beverly for family stability. My breath caught a sharp pain in my chest. This wasn't help. This was a demand dressed up in ink and signatures. I looked at Beverly, her smile unwavering, and felt something crack inside me. Did David ask for this? I asked, my voice low, trembling with a fury I hadn't named yet. Beverly's eyes flickered just for a second. "We discussed it," she said, smooth as ever. "He wants what's best for us all." Lloyd cleared his throat, his discomfort plain, but he said nothing. I pictured David, my boy, signing off on this behind my back, and the thought was a knife twisting deep. My phone buzzed on the counter, Joyce's name flashing. I ignored it, but her voice from our last talk echoed. "Trust your gut, Esther." I wanted to scream, to throw the papers in Beverly's face, but I kept reading, each line a betrayal. The agreement would take nearly half the inheritance money Harold spent decades building, money he entrusted to me. I thought of his letter tucked in his Bible, found just last week. "Stand firm, Esther, for our family." Beverly leaned forward, her voice softer now, almost kind. "We just want to secure David's future, Esther. You wouldn't want him struggling, would you?" The words were a trap coated in care, but I saw through them. She wasn't here for David. She was here for the money, for the life she wanted to build on my loss. My hands shook, gripping the folder, the weight of her audacity suffocating. Lloyd finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "I can explain the terms if you'd like." But I barely heard him. My mind was on Harold, on the nights he'd sit at this very table, balancing our budget, teaching me to value what we had. This wasn't just about money. It was about his trust, our life together, now being pried apart by someone I barely knew. And David, my David, had let this happen. I looked at Beverly, her smile still fixed, and felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. I wanted to ask how she dared, how she could walk into my home and demand what wasn't hers. But the words caught, tangled in the hurt of knowing David was part of this. My heart pounded, the room too small, the air too thin. I stood the chair, scraping loud, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "I need time to think," I said, knowing I'd never sign. Beverly's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed as I pushed the folder back across the table. The kitchen clock ticked each second louder, marking the tension between us. At 62, I'd never felt so small. But this, her boldness in my own home, felt like a violation I couldn't name. "Esther, you're being selfish," she said, her voice dropping its sweetness, sharp now like a blade. "David deserves more than scraping by. You're sitting on millions and you'd let your own son struggle." Her words hit like a slap, the accusation tearing open a wound I hadn't seen coming. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the table's edge, the wood cool under my fingers. Lloyd shifted in his seat, his face flushed, muttering, "Maybe we should discuss this later." But Beverly pressed on, her tone rising. "You think you're protecting something, but you're just hoarding what Harold would have wanted for David." I wanted to shout that she didn't know. Harold didn't know the nights we spent planning a modest life, the promises we made to keep our family grounded. Instead, my voice broke, barely a whisper. "You don't get to decide what Harold wanted." My eyes burned, but I wouldn't cry, not in front of her. I thought of the letter in his Bible, his plea to stand firm, now a lifeline slipping through my fingers. Beverly leaned back, folding her arms, her lips curling into something cruel. "David told me you've always been stubborn, Esther. He said you held on to everything too tight, even when Harold was alive." The room spun. David had said that my son, who I'd raised through fevers and heartbreak, who I'd taught to tie his shoes and dream big, had he betrayed me to her? The thought was a fist squeezing my heart until I could barely breathe. Lloyd stood, his briefcase snapping shut. "I didn't know it'd be like this," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. He glanced at me, his eyes full of pity, and that was worse than Beverly's venom. I was Esther Harold's wife, David's mother, and now I was just an old woman being pitied in her own kitchen. Beverly grabbed the folder, her movements sharp. "Think about it, Esther. David's counting on you." She turned to leave, Lloyd trailing behind, but her words echoed, each one a stone piling on my chest. David's voice through her had cut deeper than any document. Had he really called me stubborn, ungriving? I sank into the chair, my legs weak, the kitchen blurring around me. The phone buzzed again. Joyce probably sensing my unraveling, but I couldn't answer. My hands shook, not with anger now, but with a grief so heavy it threatened to swallow me whole. I stared at the table where the folder's imprint seemed to linger, a ghost of this moment. Harold's letter, his trust felt distant, drowned out by the truth Beverly had flung at me. My son had shared his doubts about me, had let her weaponize them. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the fracture of the one bond I'd thought unbreakable. I sat there alone, the silence deafening my heart, a shattered thing with no way to mend. The kitchen felt hollow after Beverly and Lloyd left, the air heavy with her accusations, and David's betrayal echoing in my mind. At 62, I'd never felt so small, but something stirred beneath the hurt. A spark I hadn't felt since Harold's passing. I walked to his study, my steps deliberate, and sat at his desk, the wood worn smooth from his hands. The ledger was still locked away, but I needed more than numbers now. I needed to protect what we'd built. I picked up the phone and dialed Marlene David's old friend, now a lawyer with a reputation for being tough, but fair. "Esther, I was hoping you'd call." She said, her voice steady, like she'd sensed the storm brewing. I told her about the agreement, Beverly's demands, and David's silence. My voice shook, but not from weakness. It was resolve rising like a tide. "I want to put the inheritance in a trust," I said. "For David, but not like this." Marlene didn't hesitate. "Come to my office tomorrow. We'll make it airtight." Her confidence was a lifeline pulling me from the fog of hurt. I hung up and felt a shift, like the ground steadying beneath me. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't just reacting, I was choosing. Harold's trust in me, his quiet strength, felt closer now, guiding my hands as I opened his old address book to find Connie's number, my financial advisor. Connie answered on the second ring, her voice calm but curious. "Esther, it's late. Everything okay?" I explained the situation, my words spilling out clear and focused. "I need to understand exactly what Harold left me," I said. "Every account, every detail." She promised to pull the records, her tone professional but warm. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "This is about control, not just money." Her words echoed Harold's letter, urging me to stand firm. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes on a small wooden box where Harold kept his pens. I opened it, finding a note tucked inside his handwriting, faded but unmistakable. "For David's future, not ours." It was from years ago when he'd started saving, a reminder of his dreams for our son. My chest tightened, not with pain now, but with purpose. I wouldn't let Beverly twist that dream into her own. I stood and walked to the window, the night quiet outside. I thought of David, his face at the dinner, caught between love and loyalty. I needed to talk to him alone without her shadow. It wouldn't be easy. He might push back, defend her, but I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed a notepad and started drafting a letter to him, not the one I'd give him yet, but one to clear my thoughts. "David," I wrote, "I've always wanted your happiness, but I can't let it cost our family's heart. The words flowed, each one a step toward reclaiming my voice. I wrote about Harold, about the years we spent building a life, about the trust he placed in me. My hand cramped, but I kept going. The pen scratching out my hurt, my hope. I wasn't just protecting money, I was protecting us, the David. The memory of his father. The letter wasn't finished, but it was a start. A spark of strength I hadn't known I still had, burning brighter with every word. The next morning I drove to Marlene's office, the weight of my decision settling like a stone I was ready to carry. At 62, I'd spent too long bending to keep the peace, but not today. Marlene greeted me with a firm handshake, her desk cluttered with legal pads and coffee cups. "Let's lock this down, Esther," she said, sliding a chair toward me. We spent hours mapping out the trust, ensuring David's future without giving Beverly control. Each clause felt like a brick in a wall I was building to protect Harold's legacy. Marlene's questions were sharp, cutting through my haze. "You sure about keeping this from David for now?" she asked her pen, pausing. I nodded, my throat tight. He's not ready to hear it. The words hurt, but they were true. I saw him in my mind, a boy building model planes with Harold, his small hands steady under his father's guidance. That patience, that care, I needed to show it now, even if it meant facing his anger. I left her office with a draft of the trust, its pages heavy in my bag. On the way home, I stopped at a diner to meet Gerald, David's old mentor from his first job. He was waiting in a corner booth, his grey hair thinning his smile, warm but cautious. "Heard David's been distant," he said, stirring his coffee. "He's mentioned you, Esther, but it's like he's lost his way." I confessed my plan, the trust, the confrontation I was steeling myself for. Gerald leaned forward, his voice low. "Give him time. He'll come around, but you've got to stand your ground first." His words stayed with me as I drove home, the sky heavy with clouds. I felt stronger, not from anger, but from clarity. I wasn't just protecting money. I was preserving the life Harold and I had built, the values we'd hoped to pass on. Back in the study, I pulled out the notepad again, adding to the letter I'd started for David. "I'm doing this because I love you. I wrote because your father believed in you even when you can't see it." Each word was a choice, a step toward reclaiming my role as his mother. I thought of calling David right then, but Gerald's advice held me back. Instead, I walked to the bookshelf, my fingers brushing a photo album Harold had kept. Inside was a picture of David at 16, holding a fishing rod, his grin wide as Harold clapped his shoulder. The memory steadied me, reminding me of the patience Harold taught, the kind I needed now. I closed the album and sat at the desk, the trust papers beside me, their weight, a promise I'd keep. I dialed David's number, my heart steady despite the nerves. When he answered, his voice was guarded, like he knew what was coming. "Can we talk just you and me?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He hesitated, then agreed to meet tomorrow at the house. I hung up my breath, slow, deliberate. The letter lay unfinished on the desk, its words waiting for the right moment. I stood, walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. My reflection faint in the glass. For the first time in weeks, I felt solid, not broken my silence, not weakness, but a strength I was just beginning to claim. The park near my house was quiet, the late summer air thick with the scent of cut grass. I walked the gravel path, my shoes crunching softly, my mind replaying yesterday's talk with David. At 62, I thought I'd known every shade of heartbreak, but seeing my son's face crumple as I told him about the trust was something new. I'd sat him down in the living room, the trust papers on the coffee table, and laid it all bare. Beverly's demands, my silence, the $7 million Harold left. His eyes widened, then darkened a storm I hadn't expected. "Mum, why didn't you tell me?" David asked, his voice cracking, not angry but wounded. I explained, my words careful about protecting what his father built, about Beverly's pressure. He stood, pacing his hands in his hair. "She pushed me," he admitted, his voice low. "Said we needed help, that you'd want to give it." My heart sank, not at his words, but at the shame in his eyes, like he'd betrayed himself as much as me. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, like when he was small, but I stayed still, letting his confession settle. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see it." He told me he was separating from Beverly, her ambition too heavy a weight. I nodded, my throat tight, relief mixing with sorrow for his pain. I showed him the trust's outline, explaining it was for his future, not hers. He listened, his shoulders slumping like a boy, again lost, but found. As I walked the park now, the weight of that moment lingered. A bench caught my eye. One Harold and I used to sit on, watching David chase squirrels as a kid. I sat, the wood cool beneath me, and thought of how David's voice had softened when I mentioned the trust. It wasn't just the money, it was the truth laid bare that shifted something between us. But the hurt wasn't gone. His admission cut both ways, mending and wounding at once. Shirley, a regular at the park, waved from a nearby path, her scarf bright against the fading light. She joined me, her steps slow, and sat, her eyes kind but searching. "You look lighter, Esther," she said. I told her about David, the trust, his separation. She nodded, her own story, spilling out her daughter, estranged for years, had come back after a similar betrayal. Forgiving her was for me, not her. Shirley said, her voice steady. Her words stirred something, a flicker of peace I wasn't ready to claim. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Roger's name on the screen, David's old boss, his voice gruff but warm, said David had been at his office talking about starting over, about seeing Beverly's truth. "He's finding his way back, Esther," Roger said. I thanked him, my eyes on David, who stared at the floor, lost in his own regret. Roger's call confirmed what I'd hoped: David was finding his way back. But the path was jagged, lined with guilt and loss. The park's stillness followed me home, where the late afternoon light cast long shadows across my living room. At 62, I'd learned to find comfort in routine, but today David's confession clung to me, a mix of hope and ache. I sat on the couch, my hands resting on a quilt. Harold's mother had made its stitches uneven but strong. David's words, his admission about Beverly, His shame played over in my mind, each one a step toward mending us, yet heavy with the cost of his unraveling marriage. The doorbell chimed soft but startling. It was David, unannounced, his face, drawn eyes, red-rimmed. He stepped inside his jacket, rumpled, and sat across from me, the coffee table a quiet barrier. I moved out, he said, his voice flat, like he was reciting a fact he didn't yet believe. Beverly's staying at the house. I couldn't do it anymore. My heart lurched, relief tangled with a mother's instinct to shield him from pain. I offered him tea, needing something to do with my hands. As the kettle hummed, he spoke his words, halting. I saw it, Mum. How she pushed, how she changed me. I should have stopped her. His eyes met mine, not with the defiance I'd feared, but with a rawness that mirrored my own. I wanted to tell him it was okay that we'd rebuild, but the words caught, weighed down by the months of silence between us. Instead, I sat beside him, the quilt between us, and listened. He talked about the house, how Beverly's plans for it, new furniture. A bigger car had felt like a dream he couldn't wake from. I thought I was doing right by her, he said, his voice breaking. But I let you down. The admission was a gift, but it hurt too, a reminder of how far we'd drifted. I reached for his hand, his fingers cold, and squeezed the way Harold used to, when words weren't enough. The phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Roger again, checking in, his voice a steady anchor. David's been talking to me, he said. He's beating himself up, Esther, but he's trying. I thanked him, my eyes on David, who stared at the floor, lost in his own regret. Roger's call confirmed what I'd hoped. David was finding his way back, but the path was jagged, lined with guilt and loss. I walked to the kitchen to pour the tea, my hands steady, but my heart unsteady. David followed, leaning against the counter, his presence both familiar and foreign. I saw Dad's old tackle box in the garage, he said, his voice soft. Made me think of those fishing trips. I nodded, picturing Harold teaching him to cast a line, their laughter echoing across the lake. That memory, once bright, now carried a shadow. David's regret, my own lingering doubt about whether I could have stopped this sooner. As he sipped his tea, I saw the boy he'd been, but also the man he was becoming, cracked but not broken. The trust I'd set up felt right, a boundary that gave us both space to heal. But the weight of his separation, of Beverly's absence, hung heavy. I wanted to ask if he blamed me, if my silence had pushed him too far, but I didn't. Instead, I watched him, his eyes distant, and felt a quiet ache settle in, not anger, but a sorrow for what we'd both lost, a fracture that hadn't yet found its mend. Winter settled over my Ohio home, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but David's visits warmed the rooms. At 62, I'd learned to cherish small moments, like the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. He'd moved to an apartment nearby, starting over after leaving Beverly. Today he brought coffee, the steam curling between us as we sat at the kitchen table. His face was softer now, less shadowed, but his eyes still carried a weight I couldn't lift. I stirred my coffee, the spoon clinking softly. "You look tired," said it, my voice gentle, not probing. He nodded, rubbing his neck. "Work's keeping me busy, keeps my mind off things." I saw the effort in him, the way he was piecing himself back together. It reminded me of how I'd felt after Harold's passing, learning to live with the quiet. But this time, I wasn't alone. David was here, and that was enough for now. I'd started volunteering at the community centre, a place filled with chatter and the smell of fresh paint. It gave me purpose, a way to step outside my own head. Lillian, a young volunteer in her 20s, worked beside me, sorting donations for a winter drive. Her energy was bright, but her story wasn't her parents hadn't spoken to her in years. A rift born of misunderstanding. "I keep hoping they'll call," she said, folding a sweater, her voice small. I listened, my hands pausing on a box of coats, her words echoing my own fears of losing David. Her story stayed with me as I drove home, the roads slick with frost. I thought of the years I'd spent worrying I'd failed David, not teaching him enough about standing firm. Lillian's openness, her quiet hope, made me see my own strength differently, not in holding tight, but in letting go of the guilt that had clung to me. I pulled into the garage, the house dark but not empty. Its warmth, a contrast to the chill outside. Inside, I found a scarf on the counter, one Harold used to wear, its wool, soft and faded. I held it, the scent of his old cologne faint. But there, stirring a memory of us walking hand in hand, snow crunching under our boots. He'd always stop to adjust my scarf. His fingers careful, his smile steady. That memory didn't sting now. It settled like a blanket, reminding me I could carry him without breaking. I sat at the table, David's empty coffee cup still there, and felt a quiet shift. The anger I'd held toward Beverly, the fear of losing David, had softened, not gone, but less sharp. Volunteering had shown me I could build something new, not just for David, but for myself. I looked at the scarf, folded it carefully, and set it aside. My breath, slow, steady. The house was still, but it wasn't lonely. It held me, Harold, David, and the possibility of something whole again. The frost on my windows had thickened by evening, tracing delicate patterns that caught the lamplight. I sat in the living room, a notebook open on my lap, the pen heavy in my hand. At 62, I'd started writing to Harold, not letters to send, but words to hold him close. Tonight I wrote about David's visits, the trust, the way we were finding our way back. Each sentence felt like a step, not toward closure, but toward something softer. A peace I hadn't known I could claim. The community centre had become a rhythm, a place where my hands stayed busy and my heart found room to breathe. Francis, a widower with a laugh that filled the room, was there, often sorting books for the library drive. He'd lost his wife a decade ago, and his stories of learning to live alone mirrored mine. "You don't get over it," he said yesterday, stacking a pile of novels. "You just learn to carry it lighter." His words stuck like a melody I couldn't shake. I paused my writing, my eyes drifting to a small clay pot on the shelf, one David made in grade school, its edges uneven but proud. I smiled, remembering his grin when he gave it to me, his hands sticky with paint. That memory didn't ache now. It rested, a quiet reminder of who we'd been and who we could still be. I wrote that down too. my pen moving slowly, each word a choice to let go of the anger I'd held toward Beverly. Francis had invited me for coffee tomorrow, a small gesture that felt bigger than it was. I'd hesitated, then said yes, not because I was ready for new connections, but because I was learning to say yes to life again. The notebook filled with these thoughts, my handwriting looser, now less burdened. I wrote about Harold, how he'd laugh at my volunteering, how he'd be proud of the trust I'd set for David. The words weren't for him anymore. They were for me, a way to see myself clearly. I closed the notebook and stood walking to the back door. The yard was blanketed in snow, untouched, the kind of quiet that feels like a gift. I thought of Lillian's hope, Francis's resilience, David's slow return. The hurt of Beverly's betrayal, of David's silence, hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned me. I opened the door, letting the cold air brush my face, and stood there, breathing slow. The night was still, my heart steady, carrying a peace that felt like Harold's hand in mine, guiding me toward whatever came next. A year had passed since that grey morning with Beverly and the notary, and I sat at David's new apartment, the small dining table set with mismatched plates. At 63, I'd learned to find comfort in simplicity, in the way David's laughter filled the room as he served me a slice of pie. His place was modest, a far cry from the house he'd shared with Beverly, but it felt like him, honest, unpretentious. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon, a warmth I hadn't expected to find again. David handed me a small wrapped box, his smile shy. "Found this in storage," he said, his voice soft. I opened it to reveal a framed photo of him and Harold taken at a county fair years ago, both grinning under straw hats. My throat tightened, not with pain, but with gratitude. A quiet tide washing over me. "I thought you'd like it," he added, his eyes searching mine like he was asking for forgiveness without saying it. I set the frame on the table, my fingers tracing its edges. "It's perfect," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was full. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when words aren't needed. David was rebuilding, working a steady job, his confidence returning. I saw Harold in him, the same quiet determination, the same heart. It wasn't the boy I'd raised, but a man I was learning to know, and that was enough. Judith, his new neighbor, joined us, her laughter bright as she shared stories of her grandkids. Her presence added a lightness, a reminder of the community I'd found since volunteering. I thought of the center, the hours spent sorting clothes, the conversations that had taught me to see my own strength. Judith's warmth. David's effort, it all wove into a new kind of family, not perfect, but real, grounded in choices we'd both made to move forward. Later, as Judith cleared plates, David leaned in. "I read your letter, Mum," he said, his voice low. I'd given it to him last week, the one I'd written months ago, pouring out why I'd stayed silent about the inheritance. "I get it now," he said. "You were protecting us, not just the money." His words settled over me like a blanket I hadn't known I needed. I nodded my eyes on the photo, Harold's smile anchoring me. The evening wound down, and I drove home, the stars sharp in the winter sky. My house felt different now, not empty, but lived in, filled with small traces of this new life. David's visits, the community center. the journal I still wrote in. I stepped inside, the quiet wrapping around me, not heavy but soft, like a breath held and released. I was still Esther, still carrying Harold's memory, but I was also someone new, someone who'd learned to stand firm and still love no matter the cost. Back home, I placed the framed photo of David and Harold on the mantel next to a small candle I lit each evening. At 63, I'd grown used to these quiet rituals, moments that tethered me to the past without pulling me under. The house was still, but it held a new kind of warmth, built from months of choices, mine, David's, even those of strangers who'd become friends. I sat on the couch, a letter from Paula, my old friend, in my hands. Her words congratulating me for protecting Harold's legacy. I unfolded the letter, her handwriting neat, deliberate. "You did what most couldn't, Esther," she wrote. "You held your ground and still kept your heart open." I smiled her praise, settling softly like snow outside. Paula had known me through my darkest days after Harold's death, and her words reminded me of the woman I'd become, not just a widow, not just a mother, but someone who could face betrayal and still choose love. I thought of the trust now finalized, a quiet promise to David's future free from Beverly's grasp. It wasn't about the money. It was about trust, Harold's in me, mine in David, and now David's in himself. I'd spent years fearing I'd lose him, that my silence would push him away. But silence, I'd learned, wasn't weakness. It was a shield, a way to guard what mattered until the time was right. That choice had saved us not just the inheritance, but the bond we were rebuilding, one coffee, one conversation at a time. The candle flickered, casting shadows on the wall. I thought of the community centre where I'd found purpose, and of Francis, whose laughter had reminded me I could still smile. I thought of David, his apartment a fresh start, his eyes clearer now. The guilt I'd carried for hiding the truth, for doubting him, had faded, replaced by a quiet pride. I'd stood firm, not out of stubbornness, but out of love for Harold, for David, for myself. The lesson wasn't loud or grand. It was simple, carved from years of loss and choices. Trust your instincts even when they lead to hard truths. They're the voice of everyone you've loved guiding you through. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't just for David or Beverly. It was for me, a way to let go of the weight I'd carried too long. At 63, I'd learned to live not just for the past, but for the life still unfolding, one I could shape with my own hands. What truth have you held close, waiting for the right moment to share? Your stories mean so much. Please leave them in the comments below. If this journey resonated, a like or subscribe would help me keep sharing these tales of quiet strength. Thank you for listening, for being here. May you find peace in your own truths wherever they lead.